Al Jazeera Podcasts.
Today, the murder of a Palestinian American child that rocked a community.
Leaders in Plainfield will gather for a community vigil to honor Wadi al-Fayoume. The 6-year-old was stabbed to death in an apparent hate crime.
As the murder trial begins today, will there be justice for Wadea al-Fayoume? I'm Kevin Hirten, and this is The Take.
My name is Ahmed Rehab. I'm the executive director of CARE Chicago and have been for the past 20 years. I'm located right here in Chicago, where our office is based.
So, Ahmed, we're talking to you on the first day of the trial of Joseph Czuba, who is charged with killing 6-year-old Wadea al-Fayoume and trying to kill his mother. Before we talk about the accused, let's start with the victims here. I know you've spent time with this family. Can you tell me about this mother and son and the life that they were living in Chicago?
You know, they were a typical, ordinary family. It was just the mother and the son that lived in that apartment that was rented from this landlord. She provided for him. She took care of him. They were each other's best friends. He was a beautiful 6-year-old boy who enjoyed a lot of things that a 6-year-old boy might enjoy, Lego and soccer and coloring and playing with his mother. And up until that moment, they had what you might describe as an ordinary relationship with the landlord. As a matter of fact, he had built a treehouse for young Wadea in the past and allowed him to swim in the outdoor swimming pool area, which I believe was an above-ground pool in the backyard. So this came as an immense shock to everyone, not least the family.
Yeah. What brought the family to Chicago in the first place?
They're originally Palestinian, so like most Palestinians who end up being forced out of their homeland in their ancestral villages and towns, it wasn't really a choice as much as it was something that they had to do for safety and security. And they really didn't have much choice in the matter. The father told me something really powerful. He had said how that his family had moved from their homeland, where they had been targeted just for being who they are, hoping to find shelter, solace, opportunity, and respite in this new land of opportunities, only for his most innocent and vulnerable child to be targeted yet again simply for who he is and butchered in the sanctity of his own home. This wasn't even on a dark alley street corner. This was in the safest place this child could find on earth, his home with his mother. And that's where he was targeted and ripped apart in full view of all of us. So when you look at this larger context of it, it's really heartbreaking in a multi-generational, more ways than one type of way.
I'm here because I'm the boy's father, not because I'm political or religious. I'm here as the father of a child whose life was taken. And there are families in the country that I think need to understand what's happening.
So they're living in Chicago, mother and son. They have a landlord. Take us back to October 14th, 2023, and what we know about what happened that day.
So the context of the crime is that obviously at that moment in time, we had been dealing with the October 7th attacks and the consequences of that, which were basically this carpet bombing campaign against Gaza by the Israeli forces. As it so happened, both family members, the father and the mother of Wadea, had lost family back home in Palestine. And so they were reeling from that. And so what happened that day was apparently this older gentleman, this person, this landlord, Czuba, was watching CNN. And he had been watching the news. He had been described by his wife as being obsessed with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict at that moment. In the media, it was basically wall-to-wall coverage, and it wasn't very favorable to the Palestinians. As a matter of fact, the case can be made that it was really inciting of hatred of Palestinians, just the way that the coverage was and how one-sided and biased and blatantly so it was.
Well, I remember the CNN coverage at the time. I remember.
Especially CNN coverage. I mean, I was actually on CNN with the uncle of Wadea later on after the crime had occurred. And I remember I wasn't watching much CNN at the time, but I was kind of forced to, sitting in the green room. And I was really shocked by how the entire hour that we were waiting, it was wall-to-wall coverage of every little detail of the families of the hostages, cameras in their homes, showing their family pictures, their guitars up in the corner, what they liked to do, what they didn't like to do, which is all fine. But there was none of that given at all
Yeah.
in terms of coverage of the Palestinian dead and maimed and injured and displaced that were happening as we sat in that room. So very little humanization, very little attention given to the other side, but every little detail given to the Israeli side. So that fatal knock on the door, and again, as far as the mother's concerned, this is the landlord calling out, knocking on the door, and has done that before. So she opened the door for him, and that's when he barged in with a kitchen knife and started to lunge at her and chase after her child, she had been preparing for a bath. And so he was unclothed, sitting on the bed, and she tried to protect her son and wrestled with this man, and she was stabbed multiple times. And then after he was able to essentially neutralize her in her efforts, he went for the child and stabbed him 26 times, killing him.
26 times. And he made,
26
this
times.
is a man who built a treehouse for this child.
That's right. Such was the hate that had been built up and pent up from watching this coverage, that he did the unthinkable, really, and did it against the most vulnerable member of our community, a 6-year-old innocent boy.
Okay, so the trial begins today against Joseph Czuba. Are there any particular aspects of the case that you'll be watching? What is the story the prosecution is going to be telling? What is the defense here?
I can't imagine what the defense might be, but I do know that he's being charged with 8 charges, 8 crimes, including 4 related to murder, 2 to aggravated battery, and 2 hate crimes, which are very important to be added to the charges, because it was very clear, even from the early law enforcement investigation, that he was motivated by anti-Muslim and anti-Palestinian animus, and that he had said, basically, and yelled out to the victims, all Muslims must die, as he was committing his crime, as he was stabbing them. And this was in the police report. And mind you, we've dealt with so many hate crimes over the years, and I want to sort of emphasize how rare it is for law enforcement to almost go out of their way and essentially pin a motive that early in an investigation, but it was so blatant that it just had to be in there. And so from the very beginning, it was very clear that this was a hate crime, and that's why it's so important that it's prosecuted as such.
Yeah, so that really raises the stakes here. This is one of those famous Chicago trials. There's been a lot of them in the city's history. But, Ahmed, when I was doing research about this case, it wasn't really that easy. I mean, a Google search didn't come up with that many results, particularly in the national media. Do you feel like if some of the backgrounds of these people were reversed or swapped out, this would be getting more attention?
100%. I mean, a big headline of this past year has been what I would call the blatant double standard in terms of coverage, mainstream media coverage of this conflict and its 2 sides. If you want to call it a conflict, I mean, you have one side that's essentially engaging in a genocide against another. So in any other situation, this would be, a one-sided attack. Obviously, October 7th happened, and we came out, we were not supportive of that, we were against October 7th, etc. But very few voices, unfortunately, from the mainstream Jewish community, and by that I mean the mainstream organizations that identify as Zionist, and their leaders and the rabbis. I mean, in Chicago, I couldn't find a single congregational rabbi, not one, that would come out and just simply call for a ceasefire. We're not saying call for a 2-state solution or 1-state solution or condemn Israel or anything like that. It's a very low bar. We're saying just call for the end of the murder, the mass murder of civilians. And we couldn't get that. The only person who spoke out is Rabbi Branton Rosen, who essentially has been excommunicated from the community and had to begin his own online congregation because he was so pushed out from the larger community. So it's very, very, very concerning. The media, obviously, also is extremely biased. The corporate leaders who sent out letters on October 7th to their Jewish constituencies and others, their employees, saying we stand with you, which was very out of the ordinary for a corporation that's non-political to comment on political matters, but they did so. Fine. Political leaders did the same thing. So you had the media, political leaders, and the corporate leaders all having a field day with their, sort of virtue signaling. But then when the genocide began, and let's even call it ethnic cleansing, let's call it carpet bombing, let's call it mass murder, or whatever term floats your boat, started to happen, and it was televised, and it was broadcast, and it was live, and we could all see the horrible consequences. There was none of that from either of the three. There weren't these sympathetic, compassionate letters from corporate leaders to their employees saying that we recognize the horrors that are happening to your families. Here are the resources for you. None of that whatsoever. It was only one-sided. There was no political statements whatsoever that condemned this and reached out to the Muslim community. And there was little media coverage of the consequences to families. They reported on the facts, numbers and things like that, but very little humanizing stories. And so this Czuba situation and Wadea al-Fayoume's story was widely covered because of how earth-shattering it was and how unique and horrible it was. But once the initial coverage of the horrors of the crime dissipated, there was very little hearkening back to that story throughout between when it happened and today.
Yeah, has the local media been any better?
It's been a tad better. Usually when there's a milestone situation like an arraignment or something like that, they might reach out to us. But there hasn't been the sort of cultural commemoration of a moment that you would expect. For example, the kind of coverage we got from students chanting from the river to the sea, which has been portrayed by the Zionist and the pro-Israeli side as being a call for genocide, and denied as such by those saying those words. They're saying it's freedom from the river to the sea, freedom from oppression, freedom from apartheid, freedom from displacement and dispossession, freedom from genocide and ethnic cleansing. It's not freedom from the humans who are Jewish by dumping them into the sea and engaging in a genocide against them. It's freedom from these, systems of oppression, which is their call and their right to say. But that was basically taken out of their mouths and reinterpreted and put back into their mouths as such. And then there was the reaction to it from the Senate. We had Senate hearings that saw presidents and leaders of universities, their heads roll essentially.
After weeks of intense scrutiny, Harvard University President Claudine Gay resigned today.
She was heavily criticized for her testimony during a congressional hearing about rising anti-Semitism on college campuses and Harvard University's response to it.
It saw changes in policies. It saw changes in the definition of anti-Semitism to expand to include criticism of Israel. And now that is a movement here in America that is being pushed by billionaires like Bill Ackman and others, perhaps Elon Musk as well. And so that kind of reaction to just a very normal chant, like from the river to the sea, became such a moment in the media and got such attention that you look back and you look at the story of Wadea and how little that got over time, and you compare the two, and it's stunning.
More with Ahmed after the break. So Ahmed, I was thinking this is like an American microcosm of this phenomenon we're seeing with the war on Gaza. I think I was talking to an author, Mohammed al-Kurd, about Palestinian dehumanization in a recent episode, and we were showing video of these children in Gaza who are asking and pleading with the West to not kill them, essentially. And then we all watched as tens of thousands of Palestinian kids were killed in this war. And this case feels like an American microcosm of this. And you're seeing that same level of apathy, aren't you?
You are, and you hit the nail on the head with the word dehumanization, because that is the basis, the psychological basis of what we're seeing. Basically, throughout history, especially modern history, before any population could be subjected to certain horrors, there had to be a period of dehumanization, meaning a period in which their humanity was questioned and they were rendered as less than human, at least less than the rest of us. So in Rwanda, for example, those who were targeted had to be called cockroaches on radio broadcasts for months and weeks before machetes were out to kill them in the streets. They had to be dehumanized first. In Congo, where you had between 8 and 20 million Congolese killed by King Leopold's Belgian army early on in the colonial period, there had to be this rendering of these populations as savages, somewhere between animal and human. Likewise in Tasmania, where the entire native population was routed out by the British, sometimes in hunting sport, not even in battle. They had to be also rendered as savages. The Jews of the 1930s, 20s, etc., before the Holocaust of the 40s, there had to be in the 30s, there had to be this long period of dehumanization of Jewish individuals in Germany as being vermin and as being this and that. Likewise in Palestine. Before you can see a genocide play out in the world watching, there had to be a period of dehumanization of Palestinians in which we're told their mothers are not like our mothers, they're not like your mothers, they're not like ordinary mothers. They put their kids out as human shields. And they don't cry for their kids. They're not normal parents. Human shields this, human animals that. You heard this from authorities in the Israeli government. This wasn't some right-wing fanatic on a blog. This was an official, responsible, accountable leader speaking in their official capacity, calling that population human animals. So this dehumanization process really is the foundation and the necessary introduction to what comes next, whether it's genocide, mass murder, or other horrible forms of abuse against entire populations.
So, Ahmed, the Council on American-Islamic Relations, CARE, which you're part of, has received over 8,000 complaints of anti-Muslim bias in 2023, the most in almost 30 years. And a disproportionate amount of those came after the October 7th attacks. Now, I first kind of became aware of CARE right after 9/11. I wonder how you would compare that era to what you saw right after October 7th.
Basically, right after October 7th, we in the CARE world tend to think of it as almost as bad, if not worse, than the post 9/11 period.
Wow.
And so in terms of the elevated media attention that basically cast aspersions on Palestinians, on Muslims, on people who support Gaza as being pro-terrorist or whatever, and sort of elevating the threat against the community, the hate crimes, the hate incidents, the emails, the calls, the chilling effect in the community, which really went well beyond hate crimes and hate incidents. I mean, you're talking about in ordinary spaces every day, teachers in their schools who are Muslim or Palestinian, students in their schools, employees in their place of employment, all of these, should they speak out even in their personal capacity on social media, as responsibly as you like, are targeted, are doxxed, sometimes are retaliated against, sometimes are fired or disciplined, not hired, not given a promotion. So this whole censorship and retaliation angle, in addition to the hate incidents and hate crimes and hate rhetoric, made it as bad, if not worse, as the post 9/11 period. We saw a 700% increase in case intakes in our office in the few months after October 7th versus the few months before.
Yeah, Ahmed, I wanted to ask you about something that happened just over a week ago in Miami.
Yeah.
I'm sure you saw this story. A Jewish man there shot two men he believed to be Palestinian, and it turned out they were actually Israeli tourists.
Police say that the shooter believed that these two in the car were Palestinians. But it turns out, after we spoke with the victims, that they were Israeli Jews.
There's a ton of layers to this story, but I'm just curious about your general reaction to what you saw there.
I mean, it was a horrible, horrible incident, and it's doubly ironic. On one hand, the irony of this man targeting two people, thinking they're Palestinians, only for them to end up being fellow Jews. And then the irony of the victims being targeted by this man, thinking that he is a Palestinian Muslim terrorist, quote unquote, and then later finding out that he is a fellow Jew. And in both cases, the rants or the cry coming out of each mouth of the perpetrator and the victim is death to the Arabs.
Yeah.
So, it's a horrible story, horrible situation. But I think it kind of uncorks the reality that there's so much hate, unfortunately, amongst, Israelis and certain Jewish communities and Zionist communities in this country at the moment against Palestinians and Muslims. And it really is unfortunate. I should add the caveat that there are so many Jewish Americans who are very much opposed to the crimes that have been committed by the Israeli government against Gazans and Palestinians,
Yeah.
and indeed have been at the forefront, along with us and sometimes ahead of us, in terms of protesting and speaking out. So definitely, there's no broad brushing and no generalization here, but back to what I said earlier, unfortunately, the organized, so-called mainstream religious communities, bar a few exceptions, have been very much either silent or supportive of the crimes of Israel.
Okay, finally, Ahmed, let's get back to the case. You've been living in the Chicago area for over 30 years, and you're a big part of the Muslim community there. Can you tell us just a little bit about how the community is feeling about this case in particular, how important and what the stakes are? From your conversation with his family, what does justice look like?
This case is being followed very closely by the American Muslim community, and I think the larger community, because this was single-handedly the most atrocious hate crime that was committed in our city and maybe in our country in a very, very long time. Again, it couldn't be, the optics couldn't be worse. You had this angry man with full faculties and agency stabbing away at this innocent child. You know, this man, his mind is consumed by hatred. His mind is consumed by these weird political ideas. And this kid is thinking Legos and coloring books and, you know, soccer and going to see his dad on the weekend and baking with his mom, things like that. Two different worlds completely, they collide. And the evil and darkness of that former world is stabbing and tearing away the innocence and beauty and light of that child's world. I have 3 kids in the same age group as Wadea. And I just couldn't imagine what his father was feeling. I've spoken with his father, I've consoled his father, I've worked with his father, or his poor mother who was sitting in the hospital trying to recuperate from her horrible wounds that were critical at the time, and sort of bearing this trauma inside of her forever. And it never gets better. I mean, this guy might be, you know, found guilty, he might be sent to jail, all of us might move on, but the parents will never move on. This will always be traumatic for them. So the only outcome that can come out of this is finding this person guilty and coming full circle to ensure that this never happens again. And for all of us to take a strong stance against the hate incitement in the media that, in my opinion, was an abettor, a co-conspirator of this crime. That's the only way that this can go forward for us.
And that's the take. If you're short on time, but still want to catch the highlights, you can check out our YouTube shorts, which are over here. We post quick clips from the best moments from our episodes that you won't want to miss. So it's a really great way to stay connected, and you should check them out. And I'll see you next time.